All right, thank you so much. Yeah, I adjusted the title a little bit to fit it better to the program, and also because I reread the original email inviting intentionally spontaneous presentation. So this talk is completely new. I created it today. It's a inauguration of these slides for you. So what I'm going to do is present a little bit about the group that we are here. So this is the campus where we're based. My office is right here somewhere, if you can see my cursor. So I'm sitting there right now. We're the Embodied Cognitive Science unit, and we've been here for 6 years. And essentially, our scientific mission is to try to put the 4E cognition approach to an experimental test. Well, doing that in close collaboration with theorists and modelers and experimentalists and everything. So I will try to give you a bit of an overview of all the different lines of research as they're coming together, because I feel like studying presence has been like the common theme in a way running through all of these different lines of research. So let me just jump straight into it. So one line of research that takes me all the way back to my undergraduate days is the basic question: what kind of system do you need to be such that the world shows up for you? This is one way of defining consciousness that comes from Alva Noe. And I'm not going to go into much detail here, but there's a kind of autopoietic enactive tradition which says something about being a biologically autonomous agent. And if you're fulfilling certain necessary requirements, then the world will be present to you. And if so, that sets certain limits on what AI can do and what can be present for AI. Although it seems recently, and I'm slowly changing my mind about this, that maybe these limits have been broken by advances. I know it's controversial, but there's a preprint at the bottom right here, if you're interested, that where I'm starting to reconsider some of the things that I've worked on in the past. That's exciting days in that regard. Another line of research, which you mentioned about mediation, is how do tools mediate how the world shows up to us? And so, one experimental line of research that I've been developing now for over a decade is this tool called the inactive torch, which was originally designed to go to a conference like yours and give someone a sensory substitution device in their hands so that they can directly experience what it's like to actively make the world show up to them in a sensory modality that they would not normally have. And what we tried to do was to put this idea that action and perception are kind of two sides of the same coin to an experimental test. And I'm afraid to say that after a decade or so of trying to make that happen, we have not succeeded. So I have a couple of papers here if you're interested. Where's the action and perception? And then the bottom right one where we redid these experiments under even better conditions. And again, we found no difference in terms of perceptual acuity, in terms of active and passive conditions. So this is, fascinating because this is exactly the reason why we're doing experimental research to try to put this philosophy to the test. But there were some indications that the active condition actually hindered occasionally people's perceptual access to the world. So it was like the world was less present to them while they were acting on the world. And so maybe these two concepts actually have to come apart a little bit more than the original enactive approach wanted them to be. And that, I will come back to this later, led then to the development of an alternative framing of action that I call eruption theory. Now, the talk today is about socially mediated presence. And in particular, there's a paradigm called the perceptual crossing paradigm, which I will spend some time explaining. But this also goes many, many years back, working with evolutionary robotics and artificial life, trying to understand the necessary condition for an interaction to appear to us as social. So not just the world showing up now, but as qualitatively social. And we made a prediction that if the interaction is co-regulated and not just interaction, but the success of the interaction depends on both people coordinating at the right time, then the interaction will be felt as social. And we did this, one of the first studies where we asked people about their perceptual awareness of the presence of the other person while they're interacting through a haptic interface. And we found that, doing co-regulation, they're most likely to rate highly the experience. So that was nice, satisfying verification of this theoretical prediction in this paper. So lots of work of that kind followed, and we started getting interested in what could be the neurophysiological basis for this shared experience. So I came up with this idea of a genuine intersubjectivity, which basically says that the reason why the interaction appears to us as social, why the presence is social and not just the world like an object, is because the other person participates in the generation of that experience in such a way that you couldn't have that kind of experience if the other person wasn't actually present or wasn't actually interacting with you. But what could be the mechanism of that? Because most of cognitive science would argue that the basis of our experience, including the basis of social presence, would be limited to an individual or maybe even just their brain. So there shouldn't be any reason why the other matters in such a fundamental way to the quality of your experience. So we want to push back against that. So we came up with a hypothesis that large-scale neural synchrony, connecting different brains together, would be the basis of this kind of shared experience. And we did a literature review looking at the emerging field of hyperscanning, EEG hyperscanning, and other brain imaging methods, which showed that even for relatively high frequency bands, you can get inter-brain synchrony. And that then seemed to suggest to us that it might be possible, after all, to even empirically investigate the basis of this shared social presence, of this genuine intersubjectivity. So we set out to actually look into this. So we started setting up an EEG hyperscanning lab here. We created a new version of this perceptual crossing interface, which I will show you in a moment. The problem was that we had to make it really fine-tuned such that we can actually couple it together with the EEG equipment and all the other equipment. So it had to be temporally very integrated. And we did all of that. It was a huge team effort. Voila, here it is. We created a data set of the perceptual crossing experiment using this device. So this is the haptic device where I'll show you again in a moment. People need to try to figure out whether they're interacting with another person or not. And we did as much recording as possible because the idea was that a social experience is not a property of an isolated individual. It's a property of two individuals interacting in the right kind of way. And so we have for two people in this data set, all of these variables, their complete sensory motor loop is recorded, the recognition times of when they think there's a presence of the other person, EEG, the heart, skin conductance, their breathing rhythms, the rating of how present the other person was at the moment when they recognized them, and so on, and some demographics and personality things. This is available online. So it's a public domain resource. So if you're interested in looking at any of these variables and looking at how they correlate with social presence, please take a look. So this is what the experimental setup is actually like. We've got the people in separate rooms wearing the EEG caps and all the other physio and everything. And they have this device in front of them, which vibrates in their hands. So this is the haptic feedback that they get. And they basically move this device around. And they have they cannot see anything. It's a bit of augmented virtuality in a way. So we're projecting onto this device, different objects, and they can interact with a static object, which in case it vibrates and it stays in the same place. Then there's a moving object, which basically copies the other person. It's like a shadow of the other person, and they also vibrate when they touch it. And there's the other person, which also vibrates, but only in this case does the other person also get feedback. That's why it's called perceptual crossing. So in this case, it's like, our eye gaze meets, but in the tactile domain, basically. In the other cases, this is a one-way interaction only. And so we've got all these recordings, 18 trials in total. And so what are the results like? Well, here's a big snapshot overview. It's like over 1,000 trials, a lot of information here. Excuse me. This is the inter-click interval. Click means this is the time when I saw the other person. And on the y-axis here, it's the perceptual awareness rating. How present was the other person at the time when the person clicked? And then whether they got it correct or whether they got it wrong. Because from their point of view, they just have a haptic stimulation. They don't actually know whether it's really the other person that they are touching or not. Remember, so we have this and this and this. These three situations give you the same feedback. The only way to differentiate between them is via the kind of affordance for the interaction, right? So this will give you a much richer interaction than if you're interacting with a static object, for example. So in a way, we see that these dots are clustered in the top left corner here, which means that when you do it correctly and you're doing it almost at the same time, you're going to rate this as a really clear experience of being with the other person, which you might say, well, that's what we expect, right? But the fact that it's happening in close encounter rather than over the whole trial, which was 60 seconds, is interesting because they could have, interacted for seconds. A whole minute is a long time for EEG recordings, for example. So the reason why they're sometimes within 1 second clicking at the same time, to explain that is not easy. So we made a Bayesian statistical hierarchical model to kind of capture all of this. It comes from a previous study where we didn't have all the EEG and physio, and that's where we like designed this model, but to build on the previous work. And we find that joint recognition, so when both people get it correct, and again, they don't know whether they get it correct or not, that changes how they experience, or that drives the effect of how clear the presence of the other person is experienced. And that's, to my mind, the strongest evidence that we have at the moment that genuine intersubjectivity could be a real thing, in the sense that, these people, from their limited individual point of view, they have the same feedback. It's always the same vibrate signal. They don't know whether they're getting it right or wrong. They don't know what the other person is doing in their trial because they're in a different room. And yet, when we zoom out as experimenters and look at what's going on, in those situations when both people recognize each other correctly, they will report in general a higher awareness of what was going on. So there was a different quality associated with that moment of interaction. And with this new data set, we applied the same statistical model and we found the same effect again. So this is already the third time that we've done this with different groups, different setups, and it comes out every time. So this is a very replicable effect, which is nice. But here's the trouble. When we started organizing the EEG to find the basis now of our hypothesis, like the hypothesis was, if we find large-scale interbrain synchrony, we should find that that is higher for the moments when they have reported higher social awareness, right? So the idea was that, these we moments, these shared social presence would be associated with these interbrain networks. Turns out we couldn't find them. Doesn't mean that they're not there. Maybe we're still using the wrong methods. But even if they're there, it looks like the effect size would be very small. It's not clear really if that could drive the effect. So we were basically pushed back to kind of like think a little bit more carefully about what is it that we're actually looking for? What is the basis for conscious experience? And in a way, we're trying to solve the hard problem of consciousness. Like, how is it that the brain activity that we're picking up with the EEG contributes to the quality of the conscious experience of the participants? And that's, of course, a tough question. So we went back to Varela's neurophenomenology project and really, with a fine comb, went through it to see what exactly we should think about the basis for conscious experience. And we kind of came away with the impression that there's still a bit missing in the framework that could actually satisfy a kind of experimental approach here. And at the same time, we were getting doubts that maybe the case could be that the actual interaction of the participants could interfere with the synchrony. And this, again, is similar to the situation that I presented at the beginning about the active perception, the passive condition. I was surprised to find that actually the highest interbrain synchrony, and people call it spurious, is when both people do nothing and there's no interaction. The biggest effect that you can find is when you compare that kind of resting state condition with either interacting independently in the same space. So you're just, for example, both with a static object or something like that. And this one, the co-regulation. Okay, so when we ask about, is there an increase in interbrain synchrony, we already have to be very specific. We have to say, in the case when the participants share the same environment and are already interacting in that environment, what difference does it make if they then interact socially in that environment? Okay, and then the question is, can we find a relative increase in interbrain synchrony? But it's shocking to me that the actual biggest effect is the opposite, that when you get people to move and when you get them to interact, you see a massive reduction in interbrain synchrony compared to the case when they're not interacting. And again, one reason why that might be the case is that being actively involved in generating action might actually create interference effects in the brain dynamics. So Let me dive into that a little bit more because that's the kind of new framework that we're trying to develop to make sense of these results. Eruption theory. So it's basically what we're confronted with is that in order to make progress on these questions about agency, about presence, about how, we should relate these theoretical questions with empirical data, there's no way around but to, face up to the mind-body problem. On the one hand, we have still the problem of mental causation. How is it that our intentions and motivations can actually impact something like, electrical potentials in our brain? Well, who knows, right? It's one of those unsolved problems. On the other hand, how could something like neural synchrony or some other activity in the brain lead to a change in the conscious experience? Again, who knows, right? And the problem is that these two are even related. Okay, we can act with respect to our experiences, and that's exactly what our perceptual crossing paradigm is trying to ask. You're supposed to let us know when you experience the other person's presence, right? So there's a change in experience changing your action. How do we deal with this fundamental problem? And so here's one proposal. We basically define operators that tell us about how we should measure the different interactions that can take place. And there are two directions. On the one hand, we have mental causation when we have now from an experimental point of view, right? I'm talking here, let's say EEG, for example. We cannot directly observe people's mental states with EEG. It's an unobservable mental cause. But if we're being realist about that cause, and we're not being reductionist, in the sense that we're not saying it's just identical with nothing but a pack of neurons, that kind of idea, then from the point of view of what we can measure, if it does make a difference, that difference will not be traceable back to something that we can measure. I call that eruption. Basically, it's an unexpected deviation or increase in entropy or increase in uncertainty or increase in non-predictability, depending on how you want to see this, at the level of what we're recording. It's more noise in a way in our data. It's something that we can't predict in advance. There's also the other part, which is how do we get something into our experience? Well, we can trace things. We can go from the sensory motor loop into the environment. We can go and trace it to the brain. But at some point, the point when it actually shows up to you as social presence, we've lost the signal. I mean, we cannot with EEG directly record the social quality of your experience. So it's a bit of the inverse. We have lots of a chain of causes and effects, but then the final effect, which is a change in your experience, we can't measure. So there's a bit of like a reduction in variability. This is an unexpected increase in variability in our signal, and this is a reduction. That's why I call this absorption. Now, that's already very helpful. Now we've separated these two, and in the case of being actively involved, we've got this interference effect, which could explain some of the results that we found with the sensory substitution device and the social experiment. So I'm already getting short on time, so let me speed up just a little bit. The rest of the talk is kind of work in progress. I'm just want to see if how it resonates with you. So we've got two unpredictable events at the body level that are basically associated with these. How does the body know how to respond? Well, one option is, and this is a very simple one, is to fall back on what's called the 1/E law, or the 37% rule, which is very well known in cognitive science in terms of sequential decision making. Essentially, you just wait a certain amount of time, you build up a reference frame for the variability of the candidates' moments that pass by. And then once you've built up this reference frame, you switch modes and say, now whatever is an outlier, whatever exceeds what I've seen so far, I'll pick that as my salient event. And when you do that, basically you can get guaranteed to find the most salient event 37% of the time. And the transition point is this famous 1 divided by E, which in case of our 60-second experiment happens to be 22 seconds. And this is basically, like I said, it's 37 gives you the maximum probability of finding that event. And this is the kind of action probability. You don't act initially, and then you act. Now, what does the data look like? It turns out that people actually self-optimize the rate of sensations to be roughly 37%. This is 35%, such that at 22 seconds, they've seen 37% of the total sensations they're going to receive. If we look at their skin conductance, we find that the average point, the crossing point, happens at 21 seconds. Before that, they're more than average aroused. Afterwards, they're less than average aroused. Very fitting with waiting time. When we did some analysis on behavioral clusters and how they move in space, we find that there are different kinds of strategies which all converge roughly, again, around the 22 seconds waiting time. If we divide the clicks up, the distribution of when people respond, we find that the peak likelihood of getting a response, again, is 22 seconds in our experiment. But we also find that a lot of people click early, so they're clicking prematurely. We can look at what happens with them. Let me just skip this. In terms of the neural coherence. And what we find is that only for people who click prematurely, their brain is generally less coherent for the entire trial, and they report more easy awareness, more higher levels of awareness, which has been in other studies in the literature found to be consistent with more emotional susceptibility, less control, prefrontal control over what's going on in the brain. And again, these people don't know when they're interacting with other people, so it's a second person effect. We need to take into account the situation with the other person. It only works for correct pressers in order to be able to find these differences. Okay, so last slide. What I'm trying to suggest here is that these different lines of research, including the experimental research, in order to make further headway and in order to interpret it properly, we basically need to take non-reduction seriously. It's not enough to just say we're going to look for correlations or compatibilism. We need to find operators where we can actually measure the differences that the mind makes in what we measure inside the body. And with that, thank you very much for your attention, and thank you to all the team here who made this work possible.
Thank you. Okay, so we unmute us so that you don't hear our opening of bottles, but we want you to hear we are very grateful and want you to feel our gratitude. So thank you very much for sticking to time, and thank you very much for waking us up for some data. Yeah, my brain is ticking along. So are there questions in the audience? Matthew is there, go ahead, and then we have Dasha.
Okay.
I only do it in order. I can't process more than that. Salience is too hard. Go ahead.
Tom, that was fascinating. Thank you. Do you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. I don't see you, but I can hear you.
Okay, two questions.
No, I do see you in that tiny little video over there. Yeah, got it.
Two questions. Don't people learn to communicate through this interface? That's one question. And in which case they quickly learn to react, and then that's how you know it's a real person. And the second question is, where does this hunch that social intersubjectivity would manifest as synchrony come from?
Yeah, good points. So for the first question, yes, it's very diverse. It really depends on the pair and it depends on the individual. So some really have a lot of fun and they start, it's a little bit like a Vasu's Reddy's work. So first what happens is that the strongest sensation is being touched by the other person. And you feel that a lot. Like if you hold still and you're being basically probed, you feel that as being someone touching you. Then it goes more dyadic, you're mutually exploring each other, and then people become symbolic. They kind of like develop a Morse code of sorts. Like if I touch you 3 times, you touch me 4 times, and so on. So it's quite fascinating to study these progressions. It's like they're relearning how to perceive each other socially. And reminds the second point was the synchrony. Why? So it comes from the idea that the basis for perceptual experience are cell assemblies. So this kind of like self-organization of large-scale neural synchrony of the brain, which solves the binding problem, supposedly, and then grounds your perceptual experience. So basically, we just took that and said, well, if perception is direct perception, and we directly perceive the other person, then couldn't it that be because the binding problem, so to speak, is being solved across 2 people, and they're being integrated into the same perceptual experience, and that then transforms it into a kind of second-person perspective.
Okay, then we had a question from Dasha. I did not have a question. Oh, you were just stretching. Oh, right then. Okay, who else has a question? I know, I feel kind of stupid here too, so go ahead. Asa.
Yeah, actually, follow up, Tom, on my first question, because like in this paper we published, Julien Laroche mainly wrote, and with Lior and myself, we actually proposed in a different concept, desynchronization actually is central to creativity and so forth, but at least to think of desynchronization, this kind of reversing the usual logic. And I'm wondering and it seems to me, at least when you were talking about eruption, that this is kind of where you're also going, right? When you're actually saying that you might actually look at things like entropy, increase in entropy and stuff like that actually is being it's kind of the correlates of some of mental shared intelligence, shared mental events. I don't know if you can speak more about maybe about this part of the eruption.
This is where my heart is at the moment. So I could talk for hours on that topic, but a couple of things. First of all, whenever anything does any work in this universe, entropy goes up. Okay, that's true for all work. And usually when we think about entropy in the brain, we think of it in terms of mechanical work or electrical work or chemical work. The question is there such a thing as mental work specifically? And if there is, what would the signature of that look like? So in a way, what we're saying is that this deviation, this unexpected change that can't be reduced to the lower level, is just pure entropy in a way. It's the purest kind of work where the brain basically has the work to do to be in a higher energy level, and all you need to do is tip it into a lower energy level, and that basically is the same as an increase in entropy. So that's one way of thinking about that. But yeah, the desynchronization is going to be part of that. And indeed, it's a kind of reversal of the old way of looking at things, where people thought mainly to cash out mental causation in terms of constraints. Now the reason why we basically dropped that is because if you were to say that being in a particular mental intentional state is imposing a constraint on the brain dynamics, you basically invite reductionists or limitativists back in and they will say, well, why not just say that the constraint is doing all the work? Why do you need the mind at all? We already know that if you have constraints between different physiological parts, well, it will reduce the degrees of freedom. There's no mind necessary anymore in that explanation. But the other part is that if you go that route, you will have to explain how it is that the mind does the work that is required in order to impose that order onto the brain. And that's where things get complicated, because you'll have to, be careful with energy budgeting and so on. So it's much cleaner to work directly with the disorder and then invert the question of saying, if the signature of the mind doing work is basically a fluctuation, a brief burst of entropy, could it be the case that the brain has evolved to be sensitive to that and turn that as a signal for taking action? And that's what I just pointed out very briefly in the end. But it seems to me like if you switch that perspective, suddenly all this data falls into place. We couldn't see it before, but once you switch it around and say, what if the signature event actually is just an unpredictable event, like a Poisson process generating one random event, and your task as the body brain is basically to be sensitive to that salient outlier, and then cascading actions follow. Suddenly all this data speaks to us in a way that it didn't do for I don't know, for years, right? We're banging our heads against the wall, and suddenly by just flipping this thing around, we can see a path forward. So it feels like a really productive move to kind of like turn this old premise around and just bite the bullet and really say, we have to give up on correlationalism and really ask the difficult question of how is it the case that the mind as such, in a non-reductive way, makes a difference to how the brain and body behave. Yeah, anyway, there's much more to say there. Thank you for your question.